So, today we're going to dive deep into the history of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And let me tell you, it is an incredible story of survival, of identity, and sheer defiance, all forged at the very crossroads of empires. But before we jump in, let me ask you something. When I say the Baltic States, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably an image of three kind of small, similar countries tucked away on the edge of Europe. But what if I told you that picture is almost completely wrong? Okay, let's just tackle some of these myths head on. The idea that they're all tiny, well, Estonia is actually bigger than Denmark. And the whole single Baltic culture thing? Nope. We are talking about three totally distinct peoples with their own unique languages. And far from being on the fringes, this region has been a historic crossroads, a place where empires have clashed for centuries. So that whole idea of a single Baltic identity, it really makes you wonder, right? Where did that name even come from? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't an identity they chose for themselves. It was actually one forged by outsiders. And here's the kicker. The name wasn't even made up by the people who lived there. It was coined way back in the 11th century by a German chronicler. He just thought the sea looked like a belt, Balteus in Latin, so he called it the Baltic Sea. It was literally a label applied from the outside looking in. Yeah, if you actually asked the locals, you got a totally different story. For Estonians, looking out from their coast, it was, logically, the West Sea. For Latvians, it was just the Big Sea. And for Germans and Finns, it was the East Sea. The name you used completely depended on where you were standing. And these differences go so much deeper than just names on a map. Linguistically, this is where it gets really wild. Estonian is in a completely different language family from Latvian and Lithuanian. It's related to Finnish. Meanwhile, Latvian and Lithuanian are Indo-European, which means, and I'm not kidding, they are more closely related to English or French than they are to their next-door neighbor, Estonian. Just let that sink in for a second. This whole history of being defined by outsiders, well, it's tied directly to the region's role as a battleground. And to really get a feel for this, let's zoom in on one absolutely insane event, the Battle of Narva, right at the start of the Great Northern War in 1700. Okay, so picture this. On one side, you've got the huge, rising power of Russia, led by the legendary Tsar Peter the Great. He shows up at this Swedish fort called Narva with a massive army. We're talking about 40,000 soldiers ready to just steamroll the place. And on the other side, a Swedish relief army led by their king, Charles XII, who was still just a teenager. And his army, get this, it's only 9,000 soldiers. The odds are absolutely staggering, more than 4-1 against them. It should have been a massacre. But what happens next is straight out of a movie. Right as the battle is about to start, a freak blizzard just kicks up out of nowhere, blowing snow and hail directly into the faces of the Russian army. Charles sees this and doesn't hesitate for a second. He orders an immediate all-out attack, using the storm as a perfect cover. His soldiers charge, fill the Russian trenches with bundles of sticks, and just swarm over their defenses. The Russian army, totally blinded by the snow and stunned by the attack, just collapses into chaos. It's one of the most incredible upset victories in military history. But here's the thing. This incredible battle, it wasn't a one-off. It was a symptom of a much bigger truth. For centuries, these lands were the chessboard, were huge empires. Swedish, Russian, German, Polish were constantly fighting for control. And that really gets us to the heart of their story, this long, unbelievably persistent struggle to hold on to their own identity while being ruled, for centuries, by foreigners. I mean, just look at this succession of rulers, from the German Crusaders in the 1200s, through the Swedish and Russian empires, all the way to the Soviet Union in the 20th century. These lands were almost always under the thumb of some outside power. For nearly 800 years, they were ruled by other people. And being ruled for that long, it creates a certain attitude in the people on top. Just listen to this quote from a 19th century German nobleman writing about the native Latvians. He says they have no history worth the mention. It's just such a shocking, arrogant dismissal of an entire people and their culture. But, and this is the amazing part, while the rulers were writing them off, the Baltic peoples were doing something incredible. It was this quiet, powerful act of cultural defiance. They wrote down their national epics. They collected hundreds of thousands of folk songs, and they started these enormous song festivals where tens of thousands of people would gather just to sing in their own languages. That's how they kept their identity alive, a history very much worth singing about. So all of that struggle, that centuries-long fight to keep their culture alive, it all leads to this incredible moment in the late 20th century, with their dramatic and frankly, long overdue return to independence. And how did they finally win their freedom? Well, in a perfect twist of fate, they sang. The huge movements for independence in the late 1980s are now known as the Singing Revolution. Literally hundreds of thousands of people gathered peacefully, singing the patriotic songs that had been banned for decades under Soviet rule. Their culture became their most powerful weapon. And once the dam broke, things moved fast. Popular movements started challenging Soviet power in 1988. Lithuania, incredibly bravely, went first, declaring independence in 1990. By 1991, all three had restored their sovereignty. And then, in 2004, they cemented their return to the West by joining both the European Union and NATO. And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question. After all that, after centuries of being dominated and a triumphant return to being themselves, the Baltic states still live right next door to the empire that defined so much of their past. The question for them, and maybe for all of us, is how do you build your own future on your own terms while living in the shadow of that kind of history?